This particular slide, this page, is one you really want to understand. And in fact, we're going to spend the majority of our time today with this one single slide. So that should give you some idea of how much information is packed away in here. What's this? Uh-oh, lost my microphone out here. My rinky-dink system is falling apart on me. I know. Pretty bad, isn't it? Maybe more technology fees is what we need so we can... You guys up for that? No? Oh, that's going to be so loud when I listen to this. All right, well, I'm just going to put that back here. Sorry about that. I'm trying. Oh, by the way, videos should start being available after sometime this afternoon, we hope. So the last episode, there'll be a couple videos available from it, and then today's, hopefully within a day or so, will be on Blackboard. So we're getting there. I'm slow. I apologize, but new stuff. Working our way there. So this slide, again, very much packed with a great deal of information you really, really have to get. You may recognize the shape of this figure here from your textbook. And that's just a slide that we really want to start with. So this slide is about scientific inquiry, the scientific method. How do we know what we know? And it has to do with the process. It's a very systematic process. It's very ordered. And I think at the end of the last class, I told you that the scientific method was not always the best method for learning new information. Do you remember that? I know it was a long time ago. Who remembers why I said you don't always want to use scientific method? Takes too long, it's very laborious, it's very step-by-step driven. You can't jump from one step to the next. So when you get a serious problem, you roll out, give me just a second here as I move us around, very good, with theory. And theory is going to be a model of interconnected ideas or concepts that explain what is observed. And makes predictions about phenomena. Oops, I don't need to make that plural. So it's a theory, it's a model of interconnected ideas or concepts that explain what is observed and makes predictions about phenomena. A phenomenon. So, what's a phenomenon? It's an observable thing. Now, theory is one of those words that you need to understand has very specific meaning in the context of science. And this is one of the first cases this semester, and we're going to have several of these, where words, depending on their context, have different meaning. And there's a lot of kind of just folk psychology terminology that people use that will get us in trouble. Another example would be how we use the term positive and negative in psychology. Normally in psychology, when we talk about positive or negative, we're not talking about good or bad. We're talking about adding something or taking something away. Well, theory is another example of a word that we have to be careful with. Now, if you were just hanging out with your friends, you might say you have a theory about something. Well, in that case, a theory would just kind of be a guess or a suspicion. Might not be very well founded. In other areas of academia, the word theory is used a little bit differently than we use it. In science, in all of science, a theory is a powerful, powerful, big thing. It is a way of explaining how a large body of observations work together. And in fact, you were probably taught in grade school about laws. And I don't know why grade schools still do this in high schools, but they teach like laws above a theory, right? If they taught you that, erase that from your mind. The word law, as we use it in science, is archaic. We don't use it anymore. There was a period of time back in the 1700s when there was a lot of discoveries being made in physics and chemistry, and every time somebody found some relationship, they would name it a law. So, how many of you have had chemistry? Remember Boyle's Law? Who can tell me about Boyle's Law? Anybody? It's a relationship between three things: pressure, temperature, volume, right? Yeah, I just love that it rolls out. I didn't know I was going to be quizzed on chemistry. So what Boyle found was that these three properties were related. As you manipulated one, it would change the other two. He called that, we still call it Boyle's Law. But it doesn't explain a wide range of things. So most things that are called laws actually deal with very narrow things. Now, you might think, oh, the law of gravity. Well, if you talk to any physicist, they talk about it in theoretical terms. They really don't talk about it in terms of law. In fact, there's a lot we don't know about gravity. So what we know about gravity is a theory. What we know about evolution is theory. What we know about germs causing illness, theory, not laws. So theory is the best thing we have. And you could go, so if you ever hear the phrase, well, it's just a theory, you'll hear that quite a bit when somebody's disagreeing with what the evidence shows, and they go, oh, well, it's just a theory. You might remind them that in the last century, middle of the century, we exploded as a nation several theories over Japanese cities and leveled them. Relativity, it's just a theory. You can make bombs with it. So theories are a big idea. So don't downplay theories. So a theory, and this kind of gets back to that slide, the question I thought, well, it's probably not too good for an introductory class. But the answer it gave was absolutely right. A theory is going to lead to a hypothesis. And, of course, there's kind of that standard definition that you get when you're in grade school and high school about a hypothesis, which is what? Educated guess. And that's not a terrible way of thinking about it, but I'm going to give you a better way of thinking about it, if I can find where I put it. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Thank you. A hypothesis is a specific prediction of what would be observed if a theory is correct. So, an educated guess, yeah, a guess is a prediction. But what we want to say is if we have this theoretical structure, if this is true, we should expect to see something over here. So, if you were thinking about, again, going back to maybe your high school biology class, you probably had that story that's really kind of famous in evolutionary terms about the moths in England during the Industrial Revolution. And so what had occurred was, prior to the Industrial Revolution, moths were pretty much white, and there were a few gray ones. Okay? And then they start building factories that are pushing out lots of soot, the smoke and grimy stuff getting all over everything. And what happened was these moths that were white were more vulnerable to predation, being eaten, than the ones that were gray. And so you would see, they saw an increase in the gray moths. So what you would predict what would happen if natural selection is correct is what? That when you clean up the effluent from your factories, you would expect to see that survival advantage go the other direction. You'd expect to see an increase in the white moths again. And that's exactly what happens. So what we want to do in science is ask questions that test our theory. And this is kind of a weird idea for most people. What I really want to do, the best science experiment I can set up is one that is designed to prove my theory wrong. Because for a philosophical reason that gets a little funky, all I can really do is determine something's wrong. That's the only definitive thing I can do. Yeah, I can find information that's consistent with my hypothesis, but I can never prove a hypothesis or theory right. There can be just overwhelming evidence, and you go, okay, the preponderance of the evidence is pretty clear. But the way we move forward is by proving things wrong. So think about, put yourself in the 1800s. Say you're interested in how evolution occurs, right? This is kind of the big one. And there were two big ideas at that point. The competing ideas, one was Lamarckian evolution, and then the other becomes this trait evolution, passing on of traits in some other manner. So who remembers Lamarckian evolution? Remember the giraffes thing? So the question is, if you were, so you guys, if you went out and you exercised a lot, lifted weights every day, would your kids be more likely to have big arms? That was kind of the idea that underwent Lamarckian evolution. And then there's also the idea that what if you lost a limb? So if you had an arm blown off or cut off or whatever happened, would your kids then not have limbs? So it turns out that that's an easy hypothesis to test. If your theory is Lamarckian in nature, I wouldn't suggest go cutting people's arms off, but you could in the lab, like not using amphibians, they'd be a bad model for this. You could, cut the limb off of an animal and see if they pass that on. And if their offspring were born normal, that would disprove your hypothesis, wouldn't it? So by disproving a hypothesis, you can move forward. Now, suppose you mistakenly thought that salamanders were a good test pool to do that same experiment. What would happen? Yeah, because it just like keep coming back, right? So it'd be you would have bad data. So you want to be careful how you set up your experiments. So we have a hypothesis, and that's going to be our prediction. And in order to test our hypotheses, we've got to have an experiment or at least a research attempt of some sort that's going to involve variables. And a variable is anything that can take on two or more values. So what does that mean? Variables are almost endless in their availability to us. Gender is a variable, male or female, right? So that's what we'd call a categorical variable, because there's categories and not much in the way of blends in between. Now, technically, you can have that with gender, but normally we don't think about it as being where you'll have any blends. Typically, the X and Y chromosomes do their things, and people are clearly male or female. Height is another variable, how tall someone is. And that's something we would call a continuous variable, because you could have all sorts of range within there. Within variables, of course, we have our independent variable and we have our dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable that you're manipulating. The dependent variable is the one you're measuring. One of the pieces of an experiment that's very important for us is going to, and we're going to be talking about it over and over again, and I'm not real sure of a good place to put it on the page. I guess I'll put it over here, is this idea of control. And the idea of control is for every variable in an experiment, I need to do one of two things. I either need to hold that variable steady so that its value doesn't change, or I need to manipulate it so that I'm only seeing one variable change at a time. So suppose you're interested in what helps people lose weight. So is exercise or diet more important? If I'm testing that question, I want to make sure that either diet stays exactly the same or exercise stays exactly the same, and the other one varies so we can test that. Does that make sense? So I want to control my variables. By doing this, I can eliminate other explanations. Now, in more sophisticated experiments, I could test both variables at the same time, but it's messy. But I definitely want to make sure that I don't have additional variables that I'm not controlling for. Because Things like age might be important. So I want to have experimental control over my variables. Trying to move through this gracefully. So I want to also, in my hypothesis or my theories, one of the things that I have to have is this idea of falsifiability. Things have to be falsifiable. That's a weird word for most of us. So for something to be a theory, so I guess we're backing up a little bit, for something to be an actual theory, for something to be science, there has to be a way to prove it wrong. And it gets back to this idea we were just talking about. Ideally, I want an experiment that will prove something wrong. If I don't have a way to test the theory, if it's not theoretically possible to test my hypothesis, then I don't have a theory. I have an assertion. And there's whole areas of thought where we don't, and that's okay, but it doesn't make something science. So if I make an assertion in science, it has to be something that can be proven wrong. So that's kind of a drop back there. I'm going to move a couple things around. Questions at this point? Everybody following okay? I know this is a lot of material. So causation. We had a slide rather on causation at the very top of class, right, in the quiz. What is causation? What do we mean by the term causation? What do you think it is? Oh, don't call me. Do you have any idea? What do you think, just if you were guessing? Uh-huh. Could be. I don't know. Flesh it out. Well, I'll tell you. All right, so who has a thought of what causation might be, what we mean by the term causation? Anyone? Yeah.
Whenever you recognize a correlation between things, you want to know how one affects the other, or if one affects the other. And so, but if you determine causation, you can figure out how they're related.
Okay, so what we're really talking about in causation is, does variable A cause changes in variable B? Is it directly responsible for the changes? So our definition of causation, if I can make it fit, is where and this may save you some headaches. In many classes in science, you may see a little triangle drawn. That's called the delta. It means change. So if in the middle of a sentence you see a delta or an equation, that's what it is. So where change in the value of one variable results in a change in the value of a second variable. So changing, manipulating one causes a change in the other. This is why in science we want to control all the variables, because we want to eliminate any other explanations. How much does, say, drinking contribute to loss of balance? How much does studying contribute to the grade? How much does reading the book contribute to the grade? all these sorts of things. So causation is about things causing changes in other things. All right. So once we have a hypothesis, we have a prediction, we want to go ahead and do research. And as we're going to find, research covers a lot of ground. At the top end of the scale, the thing that we're most wanting to have, we have the experiment. But there are many research procedures that do not have all the components of an experiment. You may not have, for example, random selection of subjects. You may not have random assignment to groups. You may not have the experimental control that you would like to have. You may use an entirely different sort of thing, like Freud did with the case study, where you look at one individual and you follow them in great depth. So not all research is an experiment, but research in general is going to be a specific process that involves systematic, or I should say the systematic, and careful I think it's one L. Is it one L and careful? Yeah. I was never the spelling bee guy. Collection of data. And data is going to be objective, observations, or measurements. Research is also going to have a great deal of structure in how you're doing it. We're going to make sure that we do everything the same with every subject. We're going to make sure that the only thing that varies is what? The independent variable, right? Now, your research is going to end up producing data, and the data is going to probably, hopefully anyway, do one of two things. What do you think? It's either going to support your hypothesis, or it's going to refute or fail to support. So you could have refute, fail to support, again, you cannot prove your hypothesis. And so what happens then is if your data coming out of research don't support your hypothesis, then you have to go back to the theory and go, there's something incorrect with my theory because my data doesn't support, my observations don't support the theory. So that tells us there's something we need to tweak in the theory. This happens all the time. There was a fascinating study done in the 60s where a psychologist trained Planera, little worms, to do a maze. All right? And so then he grinds up his test subjects, the Planera, and he feeds them to other worms, other Planera, And he has them do the maze experiment, and it looked like those worms had learned from eating the others. So kind of like the cannibalistic theory of knowledge. Now, this was a big deal at the time because in the 60s, we were utterly lost about how memory occurs. We didn't have any idea. And one of the leading theories, one of the hypotheses, kind of somewhere between the two, was that memories were represented by proteins in the brain. So as you learn things, you would form a special protein for it, and that's where a memory would come from. This data seemed to support that. Kind of an interesting thing. So if this had been true, just think of how it would change the world. It would have made it possible for us to develop pills with information. Or I suppose if you really wanted to learn some field, you could, kill somebody and kind of scoop them up. So I'm glad that's not right. But this is a perfect example of how the system works. It seemed to support that, so we'll come back to this issue of being able to replicate in a while. But remember we've said that science is self-correcting? This is a great example of self-correction in science. When this finding came out, a bunch of labs went out and tried to replicate it, tried to redo the experiment. Guess what? It didn't work. It was a fluke that they got the result they did when they did. So we're back to having a fail to support, and we have to go back to the theory and changing theory. So where have we gone the last 40, 50 years is, well, we realize that now memory is almost certainly represented by the spatial temporal firing patterns of neurons in your brain. We'll have more to talk about that. But should it be the case that you found support for your theory, yay, you would come back and develop another hypothesis. Is there another way we can test this? Is there something else that might lead us to think things are right? In making our theories and our hypotheses, we want to use something called Occam's razor. Have you guys heard of Occam's razor? William of Occam. It's not what he shaved with. William of Occam, his big contribution is that you should use the least complicated explanation available to you in explaining any phenomenon. So if you can cut out magic spirits, if you can cut out extra steps, anything you can cut out, you want to cut out. You want the bare bones, least involved hypothesis. So as we come through, ideally, we want to shave off pieces that we thought were important but turn out not to be. So that's a piece of this that you should remember. I'm looking at my notes here. We talked about being reproducible. And that's pretty good. I guess the only thing I would say, add to this, is talking about the data again, which is down here at the bottom somewhere. And our definition of data was objective observations or measurements. And this is not a trivial thing because private events are not data. Things that are subjective to you, that are just your experience and your experience alone, they're not data. They don't have a place in the discourse of science. So if I claim that a voice comes to me in the night and says that I should, or that the correct theory of learning has to do with lawn gnomes, it's not okay for me to go, and here's the lawn gnome theory of knowledge as presented to me by the great lawn gnome. Now, it's perfectly okay. Now, if I can figure out how to test that, then I can go set up an experiment to do that. Intuition's great, right? These receive knowledge, wonderful. But it's only useful in a scientific context if I can figure out how to quantify it, how to control it, how to measure it, and then, most importantly, so that you can go do the same experiment. And that's what makes it self-correcting, because you can go do the experiment and say, is that right? Is that really what we should have seen? All right, so that's that slide. This slide is enormously important, folks. You need to just know these terms, understand how they fit together. I promise you the next knowledge probe will give you opportunity to use that information. Yes, ma'am? Well, because, remember, we can't disprove. So support can add more converging evidence, but what might happen is after my new experiment, I might be able to come up with an experiment that would allow me to disprove. More information might allow me to disprove the theory. And again, we want to keep refining our hypotheses and our theories until we get them just dead on. Good question. Other questions about this before we move on? None? All right. I'm going to need to create a new page for this. If I can find, I think that should do it. Yay. Oh, nope, not yet. So what are some of the types of experiments? And if you printed these out, I think there's a little bit of space at the top there. I want to add above descriptives, there's two sorts of studies that I want to mention briefly. The longitudinal versus the cross-section. And a lot of this chapter, by the way, is very piecemeal in terms of it's just going to be choppy. There's not a great story to tell as much as I would like to have things have wonderful flow. So two kinds of studies that you might want to know about. One's the longitudinal study, and longitudinal studies are those that measure the same participants multiple times over a period of time. So I'm going to measure the same participants a number of times over a period of times. So what might be an example of that? So suppose I wanted to test the effects of a vaccine on intelligence and make sure that it's not having bad effects. So I would take my infant, give them the shot, then over a period of time, maybe 6 months later, measure intelligence. 10 years later, 20 years later, I could follow them throughout their lifetimes if I wanted and find my data. Now, another way to do that, the problem with longitudinal studies is they take a really, really long time to figure anything out, right? So a longitudinal study is good because it's the same subjects, so you have less variability in your data, but they take a very long time. So to get around that problem, in many studies, we'll do cross-sectional studies. And a cross-sectional study might measure, it does measure, participants in different groups at the same time. So if we had the same vaccine that had been given for years and years and years, I would get a group of infants who had just received the vaccine. I would find maybe some fifth graders who had received that vaccine years and years ago, some high schoolers, some people your age, some people a little bit older, so on and so forth. So then I could collect all my data in a very short period of time and compare the groups that way. So that's the difference between a cross-sectional and a longitudinal study. Yes? I can. The cross-sectional studies compare participants in different groups at the same time. That work? Okay, good. So, one of the major groupings of research methods that I want you to know about is the descriptive study. And descriptive studies are not experiments. We're not going to go in and manipulate anything. We're just going to sort of watch what's going on. We're going to describe what happens. The first example of these are the naturalistic. And in a naturalistic study, they are descriptive, the observer makes no attempts to change behavior. It's an attempt to categorize or characterize. So, if you've ever seen the movie about Diane Fossey, Gorillas in the Mist, she was interested in gorilla behavior. She just went out with the gorillas, had her notepad, taking notes. There have been famous studies done. People going in and studying Hell's Angels, these various cultural subgroups. And again, no attempts made to do anything except to document what's happening, so get some understanding of what's going on. So that's one effect or one type of descriptive studies. There's several types of them. I'm not going to hold you responsible for, but just know that that's one way that things can be studied. Now, one of the problems with observational studies is observer bias. And the real problem, so we get expectancies. The experiment here that I refer to, I think, kind of gives you an idea, although it's not the perfect example. Rosenthal and Fode in 1963 did kind of an interesting experiment. They had undergraduates running rats in a maze, but it turned out that the rats weren't the subjects, the undergraduates were. So what they did in this study is they told the undergraduates, we have two groups of rats here. One group of rats is maze bright, and the other group of rats is maze dull. And we want you to run them through these mazes and tell us what their times are and so on and so forth. Now, it turned out that these two groups of rats were randomly selected out of the same batch. There was no difference between them, but because of the observer bias, their expectations, sure enough, the undergraduates thought that the maze dull rats performed worse than the maze bright rats. And it's not because the undergraduates were bad people. It was just the preconceived notions that came into play. observer bias is a significant problem. There's no way to get around it if you know who your groups are. That's why in our studies we do what we call blinded experiments. You've heard of blinded groups, blinded researchers? A couple of you have. So the idea in a blinded experiment is, as a researcher, you don't know who's in which group. That's all coded, so you can't inadvertently influence things one way or the other. And your subject should never know what group they're in. So imagine, and this experiment's been done, people come to get an experimental medicine, and one group is told this pill costs $5, the other group's told it costs $50. But they don't know what the experiment is, so they're blinded to their condition in the group. They don't know that the other group's being told one thing or the other. But suppose you did the same thing to make it a little more clear. Suppose you had one group getting a placebo, one group getting the actual medicine. You don't want the people getting the placebo to know that they're getting it, because that would kind of mess you up. So that's what it means to be blinded to condition. And a good experiment, the best design, is one where we have a double-blinded experiment, to where neither the researcher or the participant knows where they're at. We have a few more minutes, do we not? Just a couple more? All right, I know people getting antsy. The next real problem that we get into with descriptive studies is reactivity. And reactivity is kind of the flip side to observer bias. Reactivity is when you know you're being observed. And when you know you're being observed, you sometimes behave different. Think about, Thanksgiving get-togethers or Christmas get-togethers. Everybody's acting like they normally do, probably like fools if it's like my family, and somebody brings out the camera. Well, everybody goes from their normal slouches to all kinds of great poses, and you're behaving differently in the presence of the camera. That's reactivity, and it's a significant problem. All right, so that's as far as we're going to get on this today.